Due Process, winner of 25 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2014 New York Emmys for our coverage of criminal justice and current affairs. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
We saw Miami, and it was a Sunday. There were plenty of boats and sailboats and race boats and everything, and they couldn't let us in.
And then when the boat turned around and went back, I mean, it was nightmarish.
It was 1939 when a ship full of Jews fleeing Nazi Germany were turned back by this country. Now, more than 70 years later, with the help of a new important documentary on the shameful affair of the SS St. Louis, we look at why American law and justice failed 900 innocents, among them 400 children. We meet one of those who survived that voyage of the damned and the Holocaust, despite the American rejection, up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding from the New Jersey State Bar Foundation.
It's an episode not widely known, but one that cuts to critical questions of American law and justice. Why, in 1939, was a shipload of German Jews not granted refuge? Why were they turned away by this country? I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and on this edition of Due Process, the tragic story of the SS St. Louis, sent back to Europe and for hundreds of its passengers to death in the Holocaust. We'll meet a survivor, one of the youngest of 400 children who were on the St. Louis, and the pair who've devoted themselves to spreading the truth about the affair in writing, in speeches, in theater, and in a film they call Complicit, the untold story of why the Roosevelt administration denied safe haven to Jewish refugees.
I was on the St. Louis. I was 11 years old at the time, and my recollections are that I felt truly liberated when we boarded the St. Louis.
That was just 6 months after Kristallnacht.
Berlin, November 10, 1938. Gangs of Nazi wreckers, looters, and firebugs today vented their wrath on Germany's Jews and all things Jewish in the worst anti-Semitic demonstrations the Nazi Reich has seen. Berlin synagogues were burned and shops were smashed and looted. All of Vienna synagogues were burned, wrecked, or badly damaged, and 22 Jews committed suicide. In Munich, all Jews were told by angry Nazis that they must leave the country within 48 hours.
And so no wonder the more than 900 Jews who boarded the St. Louis thought they now were safe from Nazi persecution.
My father was taken to the Dachau concentration camp, and unfortunately he was killed within a few days after Kristallnacht. After that time period, my mother then made arrangements to have us leave Germany.
And if this story sounds familiar, you may be remembering the Hollywood version and its explanation of why the Nazis let them leave.
What will happen to my passengers?
It was never intended for your passengers to land. We forced the world to realize that there is a problem with these people. And when we rid Germany of the problem, no one will have the right to object.
On March 25, 1938, Adolf Hitler made a speech in Königsberg, Germany. where he told the world, "We're quite prepared to put all these criminals aboard luxury ships and let these countries do with them what they will." 6 months after Kristallnacht, on May 13th, 1939, 937 mostly German Jews boarded the luxury liner SS St. Louis, sometimes referred to as the MS St. Louis, bound for Havana, Cuba, and freedom from Nazi tyranny.
They were first turned away in Cuba.
You know, Captain, you can think of it this way. You have landed your ship in Havana Harbor. Your part of this voyage is over. The passengers are no longer your concern. Think of it another way. They are Jews. Perhaps they can walk on water.
The German liner St. Louis, a floating prison for the refugees during their search for a new homeland, left Havana Harbor at 11:10 a.m. after President Federico Laredo Bru had threatened to send gunboats to force the ship out of Cuban territorial waters.
We were sitting, playing checkers, when the boat suddenly left the harbor. And we looked at each other, and I remember my friend saying to me, "President Roosevelt is going to take care of this."
So the St. Louis headed for Miami, and even more disappointment.
For 3 days, they idled off the coast of Miami Beach, within sight of the city lights and palm trees. They sent telegrams to President Roosevelt and the State Department, pleading to grant them safe haven from Nazi tyranny.
Pleas that were ignored by the State Department and the President.
Attention, Captain St. Louis. You are violating U.S. territorial limits. Do not approach any closer. Do not attempt to land. You will not, repeat not, be permitted to dock at any United States port. Acknowledge.
Signal. Message received and acknowledged.
But unless you're old enough to remember that movie and knew that it was a true story, this may all come as shocking news 75 years after the fact. And that's why St. Louis survivor Eva Wiener agreed to join us here today, and why psychologist Ruth and Kalish and lawyer-playwright Robert Krakow created both the St. Louis Legacy Project and the Complicit documentary.
Welcome to you all. Robert, let me begin by asking you, you call this the untold story, and yet, as we see with Voyage of the Damned, it's been told in a fictionalized movie, in a fictionalized book. It's been told in nonfiction books before, in another documentary. So what's the untold part?
The untold part is the emphasis on Roosevelt's third and fourth term ambitions to run for president, which played into the Jewish refugee question, the rescue effort, and the bombing of the railway camps, railway station leading to the camps.
So you say that what happened to the St. Louis, the U.S. turning away that ship, was a Roosevelt political maneuver?
Yes, Roosevelt, contrary to the myth put forth by the historians, is that a reluctant president taking the third term nomination at the convention, which was basically staged. Roosevelt had been maneuvering and angling to run for a third term as early as 1938 with the appointment of Joseph Kennedy as the ambassador to the United Kingdom. And the matrix is that if you look at the various things he did from 38 through 44, it becomes at least clear to me that this very ambitious politician had in mind to seek third and fourth term. And the Jewish refugee issue, a very hot-button issue at that time, would have thwarted the possibility of him gaining the support for that nomination. In conjunction with Secretary of State Hull, who was a competitor of Roosevelt for the nomination of 1940, who had a Jewish wife, basically the Jews were doomed by virtue of the political motivations of both the president and the Secretary of State.
Ruth, what made you think that a documentary was the best way to raise the issue of complicity, which is the one you've focused on?
Our foundation, the SS St. Louis Legacy Project Foundation, does education through drama. And the reason we do education through drama is that in today's world we find young people particularly have a short attention span, but they seem to focus when it's drama-oriented, just as television, movies are drama-oriented. And we felt that using that approach would be dramatic enough. At the same time, we could document exactly what happened and the information that we had.
In fact, at the State Department 2 years ago, Robert, a play that you wrote, an imagined trial of FDR on this subject, was mounted. It was also a time when the State Department, the U.S. government, apologized to the people who were aboard the St. Louis, including your family.
Yes.
Were you there?
I was.
How did it feel?
It was overwhelming in the fact that I was able to go to the Library of Congress and when we were presented with this document, true, it was a long time coming, but it did show the atmosphere of the United States today as opposed to what it was in 1939, where they finally decided it was time to apologize to us.
What would it have meant to your parents?
I'm sure they would have been as flattered as I was to have finally gotten the recognition. My parents were always angry at not being able to have landed here, obviously, but also grateful years later when we were admitted.
And of course, your family survived. Yes. Because when the ship returned to Europe, you got to go to England.
We were among the very few fortunate ones when, of course, England was on the side of the Allies, and we were spared.
And wasn't invaded.
Exactly.
Robert, the term complicity is a strong one, and it's here directed at someone who, in many segments of the American community, including many Jews and many blacks, feel was a hero. What's the strongest evidence that has caused you to conclude that there was a complicity, a willingness to disregard an apparent duty in favor of political expediency?
Well, the political mechanisms were in place under the humanitarian emergency executive order to allow refugees in flight entree into the United States. In addition, the Virgin Islands had already agreed to accept refugees, and Secretary of State Hull denied that opportunity to the passengers of the St. Louis. I'm guessing on the instructions of Roosevelt. Now, that was the June of 1939. To some degree, it's unthinkable that they wouldn't be allowed into the Virgin Islands since it posed no threat to the United States, or it would have been no imposition on the United States.
To the apologists who say that this is an unfair indictment of Roosevelt, there is an excuse that says there was a long list of Jewish would-be refugees, and to take the St. Louis would have been to move these refugees up on that list. Anything
well, it was
to that?
It was post-Kristallnacht. It was post-1938 November, in which was an event, the pogrom, reported all over the world, in which 30,000 Jews had been arrested and interned in the Buchenwald and Dachau concentration camps. It would have been pretty clear that had they been sent back to Germany, the likelihood of them surviving would have been very, very low. So regarding the numbers or the quotas, it was a clear moment when the humanitarian imperative should have been exercised. But I do want to hasten to add that the appointment of Kennedy for me was one of the main factors that led me into the idea that, wait a minute, there's some red flags here. Kennedy was known to be an anti-Semite, known to be an isolationist, known to be pro-German, and it struck me as very unusual that in March of 1938, he would be appointed to the most important diplomatic post in the United States. So it suggested that the United States is going to pursue a very isolationist policy to the point where it began to look like Roosevelt did this, among other things, to make sure that he could maneuver and promote a third-term possibility.
In addition to that, there is documentation that Breckinridge Long, who was in charge of immigration and visas, had sent a memo out to all the immigration offices throughout Europe, instructing them how to prevent people from getting into the United States and how to prevent them getting visas, with specific instructions.
And specifically about Jews?
It was not about Jews, but by this point, the attempted influx were the Jewish refugees of Europe trying to get out. Remember, this sailing, the SS St. Louis, was in 1939, 2.5 years before America entered the war. So by having the ship turned away at that point, even though there was considerable documentation in the newspapers all around America that this was going on, there was no political push to try to help the Jews in America.
I guess it's a very important, I mean, no one, I think, disputes your assessment of the Kennedy appointment as an ominous and concerning development. I do think that it's an interesting, because complicity is a strong word, because it's about sharing the intent of the perpetrators. And the question is, do you distinguish, as you thought about the title, between bad decisions, since this is before the German invasion, before the Wehrmacht and the Einsatzgruppen, and before Wannsee, that this was a bad decision as opposed to a willingness to sacrifice Jews for narrow political expediency?
Well,
and I guess that's the question.
For me, the most damning of all would be when Morgenthau commissioned the Treasury Department in 1943 to do a study on the State Department obstructionism to keep the Jews out. That report was titled "Acquiescence in the Murder of This Government," in the acquiescence of this government in the murder of the Jews. You can imagine that title, where one department accuses the other of being complicit in genocide. Now, that report was given to Roosevelt January 1944, and Roosevelt, who was running for fourth term, only was motivated to establish the War Refugee Board in response to that report, because, as one of our, in the film, as one of our scholars says, Roosevelt was seeking the votes of Jews in the United States, and this would have been a horrible scandal had nothing been done.
But you know, he got those votes despite what you say was his complicity. So how do you explain that?
Well, the point that I'm trying to make is Roosevelt would not have lifted a finger to have helped the Jews during the most dire time. And that in this case, I'm referring to the fourth term.
And yet
ambitions.
Jews did not blame him.
Well, of
As
course,
Eleanor says in your play, the Jews love my husband.
Well, of course, at that time, information wasn't as accessible.
Yeah, but we see in your film that newspapers in America were covering this story.
Well, I'm saying, yes, but I'm referring to the point that Roosevelt would have let all the Jews die. That at that point they knew that the concentration camps, Auschwitz, was, you know, they were churning out.
You're talking about 43 in the conversation.
43. I'm saying that the Roosevelt, or the historians, give the Roosevelt administration credit for the War Refugee Board and saving 200,000 Hungarian Jews. But in fact, it was only done in response to the Morgenthau report. And it was only done in response to the fact that there may have been a scandal had it been, that report had been put out, the Treasury Department report, acquiescence of this government in the murder of the Jews. And I think that it tells me that Roosevelt never would have lifted a finger, witnessed the failure to bomb the railway station. So as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not going to say it's maybe a minority view, that Roosevelt to me was like Caesar, and that this was about maintaining political power. It's not to say he wasn't a good president, it's to say that in regard to the Jewish question, his political ambitions answer my question of why so little was done.
I think that we could probably, and I think it's an important question, and we could probably debate around the clock. I wanted to bring Eva in for one other point. I'm going to steal a question from Sandy, for which I'll be punished, but it's such a great question that she mentioned to me earlier, which is, you've had to have heard about this since you were a babe in arms from your parents. And Sandy said the other day, I wonder what would be, if you had to pick one memory from the ones your parents had discussed over the years, what would be the most predominant memory from your parents?
The story my father told me that the last time he saw his sister was when the ship returned and landed in Antwerp. He was able to see his sister, brother-in-law, and their baby, not able to really communicate because there was a barrier. And this was the last time he saw her alive. She and her husband and her child died in the concentration camps. And 3 months ago, I received a copy of a letter that my uncle, who was on the dock, wrote to his sister in Denmark describing the visit on that dock. 75 years after my father told me that story. Wow. So that, I think, is the most remarkable part of the voyage that I have in my heart.
Did your parents blame Roosevelt?
I don't think they knew well enough whom to blame. I know that they did not blame the captain. My mother always raved about the captain. He saved our lives.
Who apparently treated, he was German, treated the Jews on board with apparent respect and consideration. But let me get back to what I think is the bottom line of this question of whether Roosevelt can be called complicit. And that is, did he believe that that ship was not going back to Germany, and therefore, since the rest of Europe had not been invaded, that they'd be going to safe haven elsewhere, just not in the United States? Or did he believe it was going back to Germany and therefore knew that these are people who are going to be, if not murdered, something terrible is going to happen to them?
Well, the Joint Distribution Committee attempted to negotiate the...
And I've just been told we've got 90 seconds, so sorry about that, Robert.
Okay. They were supposed to they were trying to negotiate the entry into Cuba when the Cubans turned them away, U.S. turned them away, Canada turned them away. They were scheduled, or they were ordered to come back to Germany. So as far as the American government knew, there wasn't going to be any change at the last minute.
But there were negotiations behind the scene. Could the Roosevelt people, could his administration have been a part of that? Could he have known these, or believed these people are going to go someplace safe, and therefore I don't have to take them?
None of the passengers have ever indicated, no research we ever found said that the United States was involved in background or negotiations with the 4 governments that took them. All we know was that the Joint Distribution Committee, Morris Troper, was the one at the last minute involved in the negotiations to bring them to Britain, France, Holland, and Belgium.
Interestingly enough,
30 seconds.
Deputy Secretary William Burns and the ambassador of Belgium have both stated that we should have known better.
And our thanks to all three of you for helping us to spread the story of the SS St. Louis and the controversy surrounding this country and its then president. And thanks to all of you for watching.
And if you want to see more of Due Process, join us here on 13 or NJTV each week, or watch any of our programs on demand online at dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu. See you next time.
The St. Louis was, among other things, a propaganda vehicle for the Nazis. The Nazis said, we don't want Jews, but no one else does either. So here, world, take 1,000 Jews, and then when when Cuba turned them down, when the U.S. turned them down, and remember, they also were trying to get into Canada, and Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister, said, no, you can't come here either. And then they had to go back to Europe, and they wound up going to Antwerp, and then they were divided up, going to England, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. But the Nazi press was full of stories of the world didn't want them.
Nobody wanted to accept them. So Hitler said, well, if they are not accepted in any part of the world, then we have the right to eliminate them anyway. And this was the final solution.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and watch us on demand on YouTube.